Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to this meeting this afternoon here in Houston, LaRouche PAC meeting. And my name is Brian Lance, and I'll be speaking today on geopolitics, but hopefully not as a dry academic subject. Helga-Zepp LaRouche released a statement back in November of 2014 titled, "The US and Europe must have the courage to reject geopolitics and collaborate with the BRICS," that is the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That's not just a string of names, of course, that's a collaborative effort that's come together around those countries and countries that have come into coordination, into collaboration with those five nations. That combination now represents over half of the world's population in terms of the governments involved, is engaged in massive infrastructure projects around the world, for example, reaching into Africa, involving Ethiopia, South Africa, of course, Nigeria, I mentioned Ethiopia, Kenya, Egypt, and others. And that's exemplary of their efforts. These are port, energy, including nuclear power projects, water development projects, high-speed rail and highway projects, extensive. Over $1 trillion is committed in terms of projects right now by China alone. President Modi of India has just been in Africa, arranging similar investments. These are investments by Indian companies as well as the government in these kinds of agreements, state to state and industry to industry and so forth. So this is the process of the BRICS. But what is the context that makes this necessary? And I want to briefly refer to something that Lyndon LaRouche, the economist and statesman, is emphasizing again now. In a statement he put out just shortly after Helga-Zepp LaRouche's statement on the courage to reject geopolitics and collaborate with the BRICS nations, Lyndon LaRouche put out a statement on the 4 laws to save the USA, not an option, an immediate necessity. And that goes to the economic crisis that's occurring right now. In Europe, this is the most obvious, transparent, spoken about on a daily basis, not only in the financial press, but more generally. Deutsche Bank, the largest bank in Germany, but also the largest bank in Europe, is on the verge of bankruptcy with its stock somewhere down around $14 or thereabouts, having fallen well over 75% in value over the last several months. The bank is virtually insolvent. The economic advisor, the head of their economics department, is calling for $150 billion in bailout to European banks across the board to recapitalize, in other words, to keep them solvent. An extraordinary statement coming from the sitting advisor and chief economist of the leading bank in Germany. Italy just, you might have heard, Italy at 10 o'clock last night in the, shall we call it European time, Brussels 10 o'clock, the stress test results were announced from the European Central Bank, testing the viability of the large banks in Europe across the board. Monte dei Paschi, the longest continually operating bank in the world in Italy, failed that stress test. Others supposedly passed, including Deutsche Bank, but everybody knows that this is fluff. This is razzle dazzle. What was announced just within an hour or so before the release at 10 o'clock at night on a Friday night after all the markets were closed, that is the results of the stress test. An hour before that, roughly 9 o'clock their time, was announced a bailout scheme to save Monte dei Paschi and other major Italian banks that have a total of what's admitted to be at least $360 billion in non-performing loans on their books. That's not to include their exposure in financial derivative bets and all the consequences of that, which are on the order of trillions of dollars, hundreds of trillions of dollars total. But the bailout arranged specifically for Monte dei Paschi, I believe, is a creation of a fund, $10 billion through the sale of bonds, which will buy bad paper off the books of Monte dei Paschi at about 30% of value. And the Italian government will guarantee the banks such as JP Morgan Chase and whatnot that might buy those bonds at 30% of their face value, so that in fact there's no risk at all, of course, unless the Italian government itself fails. So this bailout was arranged, and it is a bailout, since of course it's being backed up by the government ultimately, and then some additional funds will be put in to something like $5 billion to recapitalize Monte dei Paschi, and so there's no problem. All of this is occurring in Europe. Nobody really buys into it whatsoever as any kind of solution. And that's the context in which Glass-Steagall, the reenactment of Glass-Steagall, has been brought to the fore again. As you may know, it's in both the Republican and Democratic Party platforms, which is not to say that either Hillary or Donald Trump have any comprehension, much less support for Glass-Steagall. But it's nonetheless been injected into the platforms of both political parties, and that itself has set off a firestorm of debate and discussion, whether it's in the Financial Times or Bloomberg News Service or in Europe in the Handelsblatt, one of the leading financial papers in Europe. Is featured this last week an op-ed on the significance of breaking up the big banks with Glass-Steagall measures, and referenced the situation in the United States with the two political parties. So this is not accidental. The crisis in the banks and the open, relatively widespread discussion now of the reenactment of Glass-Steagall, which is the legislation that separated commercial banking, staid, boring commercial banking from speculative casino gambling in the 1930s and 1933 under the Roosevelt administration to begin solving the banking crisis of that period. That legislation was repealed in 1999 and played, despite what some pundits would say, played a major role in bringing on the 2007-2009 financial crisis. So now, here, lo and behold, in the middle of facing another blowout, worse than what we faced in that earlier period, Glass-Steagall is now front and center. Now that is the first of the 4 laws that LaRouche laid down in December of 2014. The first step being the immediate reenactment of Glass-Steagall without modification in the United States, and of course similar measures elsewhere. Secondly, because you have to save commercial banking, you want to keep the doors of commercial banks open, not with a bailout, but through a surgical operation writing off their bad speculative casino debt, and then leave the speculators, what used to be called merchant banks, leave them to their own devices, and they'll go over the side on their own momentum. Secondly, so you could call that the Roosevelt measure. Secondly, you could call the second measure a return to national banking, strict national banking. The return to the Hamilton principle, Hamilton's First National Bank. where you, under the US Treasury, you take command of credit generation, and through a national bank, the money uttered, or better put, the credit uttered, is uttered into the physical economy, to growing the physical economy, to tapping the creativity of the American people, to grow the economy, to create real wealth, which is fundamental. There is not going to be money, or more importantly, resources for healthcare, for example, for retirement funds, pension, not just pensions, but Social Security and so forth. There is not going to be resources for that, much less for food, clothing, and shelter, without a massive expansion, a hyper productivity increase in the U.S. Physical economy. As you may know or not, U.S. productivity is absolutely flatlined. There's been no increase in U.S. productivity for years now. And that for your typical monetarist economist, this is a point of utter incomprehension as to why productivity doesn't increase when there's no net new investment into science and technology. But that's the situation. So this has to be addressed. National credit is the third measure that LaRouche is calling for. You sit a national bank to bring the financial system of the United States together, top down, regulatorily, under a Glass-Steagall context. That was the context which created the FDIC and other measures before, created the regulations for commercial banking in the United States, and so forth. This third measure, in terms of national credit itself, you could refer to this as the Lincoln policy, the greenback policy. The U.S. government does not have to and should not depend on the Federal Reserve, as certainly as it now exists. Should not allow the Federal Reserve to determine anything regarding the economy of the United States based on monetary policy, the opening up and turning off of the faucet in terms of cash and credit. Instead, through a national bank, the uttering of credit, as I was just speaking of, is the means by which the real economy of the United States can be bolstered and built up again. The fourth measure that LaRouche identified, was a full crash program for investment in fusion energy. Fission now, we need it. We need nuclear power plants. This, of course, is part of the BRICS initiative, where they're building across Eurasia and Africa hundreds of nuclear power plants at this moment. Advanced nuclear power plants, third generation and fourth generation and so forth, nuclear power plants. We need that now, but we need to make the breakthrough. Productivity is the outcome of the investment on the frontiers of science. Just like the US space program itself, these programs pay off a multiple over what's involved in terms of an investment of resources, because of the new knowledge gained in terms of principles of science, principles of knowledge about the universe around us, which then in turn applied by an increasingly creative population, right, whose capabilities are increased by those actual discoveries. You know, discoveries are knowledge. That new knowledge then applied through the economy, throughout the economy, radiating out through the economy, gives us the next set of breakthroughs that we require, and so on. We're returning to the kind of perspective that drove the United States, as we'll come to in the discussion of what geopolitics is aimed at heading off, that drove the revolution in terms of steam, railroads, oil and gas, and in the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century. Now, parenthetically, a crash fusion program is also the basis for going into space, seriously, in terms of not only manned exploration in terms of up to the space station and whatnot, or simply stepping foot on the moon, but moving to colonize the planet of Mars from the moon and beyond. That is, to develop the forms of propulsion that will allow us to get to these farther reaches, farther, at least for us now, in short durations, in a matter of days as opposed to months, for example. As you may have seen recently, more and more data is showing, including the increasing death rate from heart disease among US astronauts, that these long durations in space come with a heavy penalty, which we have not yet figured out how to overcome. It's not to say they can't be overcome, but they're real. And therefore, you don't want to expose men and women in outer space, for example, traveling to Mars for months at a time and traveling back. You don't want to expose them to those kind of extended periods of radiation, zero or close to zero gravity, and so on and so forth. So fusion propulsion has been known since the 1950s and 60s, actually going back to the 40s in terms of principle, that fusion energy, before you get to matter, antimatter reactions, is the choice, the option, the availability. And of course, on the moon, we have helium-3 as a source of fuel, the best fuel, the most efficient fuel for the development of fusion reactors for generating energy, whether here on Earth or otherwise, or on the moon, and for propulsion in terms of manned missions. So these are the four principles, four laws that LaRouche laid out as absolutely essential, as he said, an immediate necessity for adoption in the United States. Behind all of this is the premise of human creativity. As the fundamental, as we've discussed, as we constantly come back to now, the fundamental issue before mankind. Do we recognize here in the West any longer, do we recognize what we are as human beings and what that capability actually represents and how we can apply it to create a future, a new future, as opposed to playing Pokemon or something similar, or poking around. And that issue of creativity is in the issue, of course, that's the basis, the premise of productivity, of real productivity, increasing the capacity of men and women to generate increasing changes on nature for mankind now and for the future. Now we're moving in that direction with the new Silk Road, with the new One Belt, One Road, from the BRICS, from China, and so forth. We have that with the initiatives of the Chinese space program, which is incredibly important. This is what we have to bring the United States into, as Helga-Zepp LaRouche was putting it in her statement, to collaborate with the BRICS nations. All right, so there's much more to be talked about in terms of the international situation. Just to underscore this, terrorism, international terrorism, is everywhere now. Both in terms of what we're facing in terms of ISIS and al-Nusra and so forth, which is occurring on a weekly, if not daily basis in terms of in Europe and the West, so-called, beyond Syria and Iraq and the rest of West Asia. But also now we have it in the form of other forms of terrorist actions. We have the computer-driven, violent computer game-driven forms of terrorism. The Interior Minister of Germany has put out a call since the terrorist event in Munich that resulted in 9 people being killed and many more wounded. An 18-year-old kid who was addicted to violent video games has put out a call echoing what, again, Helga-Zepp LaRouche had called for years ago, that these violent video games have to be curtailed. That these games that started as training mechanisms to train soldiers to increase their kill ratios in battle. From World War II and so forth, we knew, it was understood that most American soldiers, most soldiers that come out of a Christian background, and I assume the same as for many other parts of the world in terms of their own cultures, have a hard time pulling the trigger on another human being. And if you can pre-program them, so to speak, if you can put them through a training session in which they're essentially conditioned, behaviorally conditioned, to see themselves essentially as pulling the trigger on a non-living, thing, image, then the result is an increasing kill ratio in the battlefield. And these games literally morphed, if you will, into the private sector, and from there into the gaming world, and became what we have now in terms of the entire plethora of violent video games. And of course, along with that, the development of the so-called dark net. That is the feature of the internet, which is essentially anonymous, is encrypted, is essentially accessed through gateways and so forth. Where, for example, this Munich young man in Munich purchased his Glock and over 300 rounds of ammunition to carry out, to perpetrate the attack there. And then of course, we have the process going on of suicides and family suicides and so forth, which is another feature of this violence going on. So this is part of what has to be addressed. We have a breakdown of Western civilization going on.
PTSD veterans.
PTSD veterans is another feature of it. And again, this intersects, of course, the situation with our police forces, because you have, obviously, you have many veterans who then go into law enforcement as a career. There's no problem with that whatsoever. However, the point is, many of them are coming off of these tours of duty, multiple tours of duty, for example, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and so forth. And they've also, in many cases, been put through these kinds of behaviorist training programs, point-and-shoot training programs. And so we're seeing, we've seen these jumps of seemingly incomprehensible, I'll put it that way, actions by police officers under duress, under obvious duress, but nonetheless, basically situations where they decide to point and shoot. So this is part of what we have to address in terms of a new paradigm in terms of the BRICS. Now, I want to come to geopolitics, and as the statement read by Helga LaRouche, the U.S. and Europe must have the courage to reject geopolitics and collaborate with the BRICS. What is meant by this term geopolitics? It's familiar to most people as a word, but it's one of those, one of these gobbledygook words, which gets thrown around. Henry Kissinger, or Zbigniew Brzezinski may use it. Other people, you might hear it on some of these talking head shows, when they're talking about Afghanistan or whatever, or U.S.-Russian relations and so forth. But what is geopolitics? And I'd like to premise this. Geopolitics is a British disease. It's a specific British product of the British Empire, product of that mind, and perhaps, if you want, the Venetian minds that came before the British minds were created of a similar ilk. But the British Empire disease of geopolitics is what we're discussing. And to make the point, really, you have to step behind geopolitics, which we're coming to here, and recognize the fundamental kind of bedrock or swamp, maybe is a better way of putting it, of of British epistemology, which is Darwinism, and more recently, of course, it's artificial intelligence. It's the idea that, in fact, human creativity can be mimicked or created by machines, which comes down to the same thing. If creativity is something that can be produced by a machine, well then, you know, we already know the behaviors of animals can be mimicked by machines. So we're really just reducing human beings down to animals or machines. Take your pick. In other words, these are simply actions, repeatable actions. Behaviors as animals are repeatable actions. A cow grazes today pretty much the way it grazed 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. Through breeding, there's more breeds, there's specific breeds, whatever. That's man's intervention to a large part. But cows are cows, cats are cats, dogs are dogs, and so on and so forth. And because they're repeatable, they can be mimicked, right? They're repeatable, so you can program, you know, a set of orders, if you will, feedback loops, negative feedback, positive feedback loops, and so on and so forth. Then you can generate the behavior that you wish of this sort. Anyway, the point here, go to Darwinism. It's not a question of whether there's not evolution or not. I mean, it's more a question of what you want to call evolution. What is that process that you call, quote unquote, evolution? But Darwinism assumes that man is simply an ape, right? That we simply evolved as another form of ape. That's what Darwin was saying. So this is, you know, this is what, this is where geopolitics emerges as out of this mentality.
And Malthusianism.
Malthusianism, yes, right. In other words, a Hobbesian world. Thomas Hobbes, the educator of, among other quote-unquote scientists, is Galileo. Thomas Hobbes, the world of each against all, which requires what? It requires a Leviathan. It requires a power over and above humanity to impose order on chaos, because otherwise it lends itself to increasing chaos and unending strife. So this is the core British epistemology. So now we come to geopolitics. If you want to put up the image here, and Peter, could you remove that thing in front of the little box there in front of us, so we have it up on the screen here.
Turn the lights out.
Let's see how it projects. Probably. All right. Now, the father of geopolitics is Sir Halford Mackinder, who died shortly after the beginning of the Cold War. He died in 1947. His major study was in the field of geology and human geology in particular. He started out studying zoology and ended up, I guess you could say, really obsessing over geography and geographical determinism. In other words, this flows directly out of a Darwinist, Malthusian outlook. Man's actions, behaviors, and so forth are determined by his geography. And out of this, you get people like Carlton Coons and so forth, the origin of the races, the idea that there's 5 separate races, quote unquote, human races. And of course, they have different characteristics, and you know where that's going in terms of the implications of it. This is the kind of thing that, again, this is the British disease, British Empire's epistemology at work. And so he saw this issue of physical geography and human geography as a single matter. For example, and he's quoted, this is from Foreign Affairs, from the Council on Foreign Affairs, from an issue in May-June issue in 2010. It quotes Mackinder on China, that if they expand their power beyond their borders, they might constitute the yellow peril to the world's freedom. This is quoting Mackinder from back, at the turn of the century. And underscoring the very mindset that the Council on Foreign Relations, for example, represents today as part of as an extension of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Another way of referring to geographic determinism is the revenge of geography, that it dictates the constraints, and so on and so forth. Now, in his 1904 paper, The Geographical Pivot of History, he posits the heartland theory, okay, which is generally considered, where geopolitics, this is where you have the birth of geopolitics, is with Mackinder's 1904 work on the geographical pivot of history. And as you see there, the geopolitical pivot, if you will, the geographical pivot of history is the area over Russia. What was Russia then, what would become the Soviet Union, what is now Russia today, is the heartland, the pivot area of history. He refers to it as the heartland as well. In 1990, he put it this way, and then we'll kind of discuss this a little. He who rules East Europe rules the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. And this was written in the context, he was writing then in the context of the Versailles negotiation, what became the Versailles Treaty, settling World War I. And his concern was that a buffer zone be built up of small countries, small controllable countries, between, in particular, Germany and Russia, so as to prevent Eastern Europe, a reach into Eastern Europe from Germany, taking control of the heartland, Russia, and having gained control of the heartland, commanding the world island, which is, looking at it as a totality, it's all of Eurasia plus Africa as one geographical unit, one, continually connected unit. That's what he's referring to as the world island. And then you have the other islands around it. Let's see if I have, there's the inner islands, which includes Japan on the one side and England on the other, the United Kingdom, the British, home of the British Empire. And then beyond that are the outer islands. That's referred there as the outer crescent or insular crescent, which is the United States, Australia, and whatever else you want to speak of as being further out from that central heartland and world island. All right, pretty obscure in some ways, right? This is again but this is not academic theory. All right. Let me just interject here. Before geopolitics, you had the Great Game, which we'll come back to a little bit, which was, again, the effort, that was the term used at the time, of Britain in conjunction with various and sundry allies, France, at a certain point Japan, and so forth and so on, to box Russia in and prevent Russia from moving south, the Russian Empire, supposedly to keep it from moving south. But in reality, it was to maintain and protect the British Empire, which reached all around that inner crescent, including India and so on and so forth, right? But you had the Great Game. But what Mackinder is concerned about, Halford Mackinder, Sir Halford Mackinder, one of the founders of the London School of Economics, what he's concerned about is that in the 20th century, as opposed to in the 19th century, where mountains and deserts, the Sahel, the mountains of the Himalayas, you can think about it, all prevented or are natural impediments to the spread of a heartland-based empire, and where the lack of transportation from the inner crescent, if you will, of Western Europe in particular, prevented countries from Europe from going in and conquering the heartland. In the 20th century, that has all changed. First of all, the potential for a European, specifically German invasion of Russia, right, was now possible. Napoleon had failed, right, to put it another way. But with railroads in the 20th century, now the potential of Germany to conquer Russia now became a possibility. And then with that, with the capture of the heartland, you then have the leverage to control the world island, which is the vast bulk of the world's natural resources. This is the framework that he puts it in, all right? Eastern Europe is the gateway to that heartland, through which this comes back to what he was concerned about in terms of the negotiations a few years later, in terms of what became the Versailles Treaty. His successful recommendations in terms of the Versailles Treaty, successful in his terms. His other concern, major concern, was of a Russian-German alliance, a Russo-German alliance. That what Germany could contribute in terms of its army and its growing sea power and industry to what Russia had in terms of its strengths, would essentially make it unstoppable. That combination would be unstoppable. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Today, right now, right? And this is what the Cold War was about, and this is what is going on now. But we'll continue here. But that's a sense of geopolitics as physical geography and as human geography wedded together. Now, I think just to underscore a couple of notes on this. First of all, besides the fact that what's the premise here? Again, to just remind everyone, because we hear this all the time. Well, there has to be a balance of power. We have to ensure that certain countries don't have too much power relative to other countries. And of course, as Mackinder stated explicitly, it's been Britain's role to maintain a balance of power in what we would call today Eurasia, right? Over the heartland and over the world island, a balance of power. That has been the basis of British foreign policy, as Halford Mackinder, who's certainly a knowledgeable figure on the inside of this, knows full well. There's also there's the idea of balance of power. Why not a cooperation among nation states? Why not? What happened to the Treaty of Westphalia and the lessons of the Treaty of Westphalia of 1438? If my memory serves me correctly.
Say that date again.
1438, the Treaty of Westphalia.
1648.
1648, excuse me, thank you. 1648. The end of the 30 Years' War. It started in 1618. The conclusion of the Treaty of Westphalia among the nominally, I'll say nominally because I mean much more was involved than simply the religion, but the war between Catholics and Protestants, in which 40% of the parishes plus disappeared in Europe, and almost a similar amount of the population was extinguished in that fratricidal war over 30 years. And the conclusion, negotiated by Richelieu and others, right, was a conclusion based on the interest of the other, that each of the emerging nations would work towards the interest of the other, that would be the basis going forward of relations among nation states. All past, basis for revenge and so forth were to be forgotten, such as Mandela negotiated in terms of the ending of apartheid in South Africa. No revenge. We've got to move forward out of this hell. And that was the Treaty of Westphalia in a nutshell. So why now are we talking about balances of power, control over the heartland, the power of the inner crescent or whatever to compensate for, or building buffers in Eastern Europe and so on and so forth? What happened? I would also just underscore, implicit in is fixed resources, because this is, Mackinder is emphasizing this. This is about the control of resources in terms of the world island. This is the world's resources, and we can't allow this to come under the domination of a German, Russian, or a German or a Russian Japanese. He also raises that potentiality. Chinese, Japanese, Russian alliance, whatever. We can't allow that to occur, because then they control these resources. And this is echoed again, I'll come back to it if we have time, National Security Studies Memorandum written in 1974 by Henry Kissinger, which is still operational policy in the United States today in terms of foreign policy. That we have to ensure a zero or as close to zero population growth rate as possible in the continent of Africa, as well as in Asia, because we are going to require the resources of that continent for ourselves in the future. That's an echo of this, of the Malthusian outlook, right, of the limits of resources, and therefore, obviously, the question of who's going to get those resources and who doesn't. And that, of course, defines the Hobbesian trap, right? It's the lifeboat ethic, right? We're on this lifeboat.
Take a whole continent and shuck it.
We're on this lifeboat together. There's only so much food. We're running out. Who lives? Who dies? Right? Now, why? What happened? What had happened? How are we doing on time? Pretty well. All right. Let's take a step back. I should say one thing. There's Alfred Thayer Mahan, M-A-H-A-N, an American, who's also to be noted in this. I'm not going to deal with this in detail. He was emphasizing the sea power, and the development of sea power as the basis of power in the world, and how and of course advocating that the U.S. ally itself with the British Empire to control through choke points, coaling stations, and other resources and access to resources through naval power, the world, and was very influential. He rose to a admiral in semi-retirement, but he was a Navy captain. But again, he's basing himself on this notion of naval power as the key to geostrategic policy making and so on and so forth. But, enough on. I'll just leave it to that. I'll leave it as that. So stepping back now, let's go back and look at what the British were actually so freaked out about. Because they were freaked out about, and geopolitics is as much aimed at the United States, even though that map of Haushofer puts the United States way off, on the edge, about to fall off the map. was as much aimed, if not more so, aimed at the United States than it was at anything in Europe or in terms of controlling Europe. Let's go back to Friedrich List, who's 1789 to 1846. Now, Friedrich List was born in Württemberg in what's now Germany. He moved to the United States in 1825. He became a U.S. citizen. He was an editor. He was also a financier of one of the first U.S. railroads from Reading, Pennsylvania, moving coal to Philadelphia for the industry, and from Philadelphia elsewhere around the East Coast. So he was one of the major figures in the building of one of the first railroads in the United States. I have it here somewhere. It was finished in 1832. He came here in 1825. In 1827, he gave the following speech. This is a famous quote from List. I herewith declare war against the system of Adam Smith on behalf of the American system of political economy. And that was his. That was what he was about. So let's develop that a little bit. He saw economics as what was, at least at the time, termed political economy. That is, that it's conceived of, economics is conceived of as the study and application of the steering and giving direction to economic development. The economy, the physical economy. That's what economics is about. So you find this in LaRouche's writings, not so much recently, but you find him utilizing the term political economy. And some of our books, The Political Economy of the American Revolution and so forth, echo this terminology in which List appears. The Civil War in the American System includes some selections from List. He emphasized, he coined the term productive forces. Actually, or better put, he borrowed this from Alexander Hamilton, who he credited with many of his ideas. He also talked about, this is very much in line with the principle underlying the four laws of LaRouche. He emphasized the capital of the mind. The capital as in capital investment, but the capital of the mind in terms of the creative capacities of mankind. And introduces the question of basic technologies. Not that technologies exist, obviously people knew what we know today is technology. Basic technologies was for him, what are those basic technologies specifically which introduce increased productivity and physical output that transform the economy, that grow the economy, not just kind of linearly in breadth, but if you will, in depth, right? Or transform it all together in terms of new paradigms. So this is the heart, along with specifically railroad systems, not just a railroad, but railroad systems, which he discusses in the National System of Political Economy. That's his major work, which has a whole history of circulation and influence, and we'll get into a little bit, but also in Asia, which I'm not going to really touch on. So he was involved in this railroad from Reading to Philadelphia. He went back to Germany as a official counsel from the U.S. government. He was in Leipzig as a counsel or counsel general in Leipzig. And in Leipzig, he drew up a program for the development of what is now Germany, centered on Leipzig, a web of railroad systems to be built up across Germany. And lo and behold, today, the major railroad lines today are the railroad lines that List had specified. He was an editor both in Germany and in Paris, advocating this approach. The London Economist called him a great agitator, dangerous, an agitator. He was an avid protectionist. He was
He was promoting the expansion of the Zollverein system, which was the customs union system to encompass all of what is now Germany. And that effort, he's held as responsible for as the figure that actually laid the basis for the unification of Germany through that his successful promotion of that creation of a customs union, which essentially created a protectionist system that protected internal German industry, to be built up, rail systems and all the rest, the infrastructure for that industry to be built up over a period of decades. And he went on, the London Times referred to him as having the most erroneous and absurd notions. And he went further. He developed the European Asiatic Railway Line proposal to build a network of rail lines through the Balkans and Constantinople all the way to Bombay, India. This is a man who lived in the future. He lived in terms of what he was creating that he would realize or would be realized in the future. And these were the American system ideas. That's where he's coming from, that he brought to Europe. Now, so this is the 1830s, 40s, and so forth. And he actually went to Britain in an effort to win the British over to this perspective, warning them that this was the future, that rail systems and so on was going to lead to the development of continental Europe. And Britain, with its financial power, resources, had a choice, was to either disappear as an empire or to join in investing in this development, this perspective. He met with Prince Albert, the consort of Queen Victoria. He met with Lord Palmerston and so forth, and you can imagine the reception that he got. But that was his initiative. So we leave Friedrich List with those ideas planted in Europe, including in Russia. Now, in the 1860s, again, we're still in the 1860s. Halford Mackinder isn't writing until 1904, all right? But in the 1860s, including in the period of the Civil War, you've got to keep this in mind, there was a US-Russia alliance. The Russian Navy was sent by the Tsar to the ports of San Francisco and New York as a show of force that their command would be turned over to Lincoln if the British entered the war on the side of the Confederacy. This is an historic fact. It's documented, little known today, but it's something that you can dig up with a little bit of searching with the search engine. It doesn't take a lot these days. And so this alliance for the development of mankind, the freeing of the serfs just 2 years after the freeing of the slaves by Lincoln, is just a reflection of this process that was going on. In 1869, the United States completed the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was, of course, a remarkable feat. In 1876, the centennial, there was the famous Philadelphia exhibition, which put on show these, as many people here have seen, and the Civil War in the American System book, I think, has some of the stereotypes of that, if I'm using the word right, or maybe I'm mispronouncing it. But anyway, the predecessor of photographs of these machines at the Philadelphia exhibition, these huge, enormous steam engines, roughly 50, 60 feet high. I mean, pistons, belts, all of this was being explored and applied, and all of this was put on display. Lincoln's greenback policy had made this a reality. The U.S. had built itself up in the course of and coming out of the Civil War. The U.S. was being transformed by not only the Transcontinental Railroad, but by the development of, the coal-powered machinery and beyond. And then in 1878, you have Bismarck in Germany returning to list policy, which had been deep-sixed for a period of a couple of decades. Chancellor Bismarck comes back in 1878 and initiates the protective tariff in Germany, right? To reconstitute, an independent German industry and an independent industrial policy for Germany, modeled on the American system policies of list. In 1876, that's the Centennial. Among the visitors to the Centennial in Philadelphia was Dmitry Mendeleev. Jumping ahead of myself in time here. Where he returned from, advocating obviously the development of rail and industry, and calling for protective tariffs. This is Mendeleev, the chemist, right? People today compartmentalize these things. These thinkers didn't know these bounds, rightfully so, of protective tariffs for the creation of the conditions for the development of Russian industry. Peshine Smith was sent by Henry Carey, the advisor to Lincoln, to Japan, to play his role in the Meiji Restoration in Japan, the industrialization of Japan, and so forth. And so all of these threads were pulled together by Sergei Witte, who became the finance minister of Russia. And it's Sergei Witte who then launches the Trans-Siberian Railway, right? The longest railway, 5,800 miles long, across 10 time zones, right, in Russia, with the perspective of moving a growing Russian population, moving a segment of that population eastward, as the U.S. moved the population westward, right, with the Transcontinental Railroad and similar projects. Witte's perspective was in terms of this development of industrialization, the development of a necessary growing agricultural base, that moving east into what we call Siberia, which is a very variegated, huge area with enormous rich agricultural land and so forth. It's not all tundra. That this was the future for Russia, but also he not only had a perspective, but the Trans-Siberian Railroad itself, as advocated by Witte as he carried that out as finance minister of Russia, also involved the Chinese. The eastern end of the railroad going into Vladivostok, the shortest, most efficient route, partly because of terrain, but also just in terms of as the crows fly kind of measurement, was to take it through Manchuria. And Witte entered into negotiations with China and also with other negotiations with Japan to draw them into this perspective, because another feature of what he was advocating, this is from the standpoint of modernizing Russia itself, right, was that the industrial markets for Russian industry was not going to be largely Western Europe, because Western Europe was ahead of Russia. It wasn't going to be able to compete. There wasn't a consumer market that could buy all kinds of cheap Japanese goods or cheap Chinese goods, that we had for years coming in here, from Japan and then later China. There wasn't that kind of consumer market, for doodads or whatever, what my dad called junk. The point was that the real markets for industry being developed in Russia was going to be China and Asia beyond that, right? So it made perfect sense, absolute sense, to connect it. And of course, a kind of leapfrogging process you can see here. Then China picks up and grows, building on what the Russian inputs coming across the Trans-Siberian Railway and so on and so forth. So this was the perspective, and he drew. There's a lot to this. I mean, he organized the financing of the railroad through a so-called gold ruble proposal. And essentially a gold-backed ruble investment was offered to international investors in terms of financing the railroad. That they essentially were being guaranteed with gold, and in particular, French investors were a major factor in investing into the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The material for the railroad, a lot of it came from Germany, which was then Russia's largest trading partner. You begin to see what Mackinder was, and his crowd, his ilk, his imperial elk, were freaking out about. And the locomotives were purchased from the United States for the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So there was this international coordination and collaboration. Russian engineers, teams of them, scores of them, came to the United States in the 1870s, and more in the 1880s, came to the United States to study American railroad building technology, know-how, and so on and so forth. One of the chief engineers on the Trans-Siberian Railway was one of Lincoln's top railroad advisors, experts, engineer out of West Point. So this is some of what was going on in this effort, with the negotiated collaboration with China and the work to open up similar things with Japan. So what was the response? What was the response from Edward VII and the British Empire? Remember, Prince Albert had met with Liszt. Edward VII was the son of Victoria and Albert. And the British Empire's response to this was to create what Chancellor Bismarck, called a nightmare of coalitions against Germany in particular, but obviously aimed at a game of divide and conquer, exactly based on the kind of heartland theory of Mackinder. So we're into the period. This is the period in which Mackinder's writings are circulating, right? His major work, initial work, was 1904. That's the period in which we're basically operating, right? You had the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, with Russia, with the support of France and Germany, taking the side of China in terms of the final settlement. This was over. This is obscure European politics from the standpoint of most Americans, but what was being fought out was the future of mankind in many respects.
Sorry, so who was on the side of China?
Well, in terms of the final settlement, the war was over. Japan, with the support of Britain, attempted to seize Formosa, right, to seize Korea, and what we know today as Korea. And seized parts of Manchuria, and they won that war, and they demanded, this territory, Formosa, chunk of Manchuria, and so on and so forth.
Japanese did.
The Japanese did. Did I misspeak? Did I say Chinese?
No,
the Japanese. Yes.
I'm sorry.
No, that's right. The Japanese attempted to seize this. Witte counters attacked, if you will, by pulling in France and Russia and Germany together into an alliance, saying no to the Japanese. You're not going to do this. Britain sided with Japan, but Japan decided, no, this is too big for us. We can't. So they settled on a huge indemnity that China would pay. This is under the Qing dynasty, which was a weak dynasty in China, but these are the conditions under which they agreed, and which Witte agreed to backstop China on. Witte created the Russian-Chinese Bank, if I have the name right here, the Russo-Chinese Bank, with, again, French support to finance the payment of the indemnity over time to Japan. In other words, he was trying to hold China together. He was trying to maintain this route through Manchuria as part of the Siberian Railway and this broader conception, a Eurasian perspective, if you will. So this is part of the machinations going on. In 1902, there's an Anglo-Japanese treaty. So then in 1904, there's the Russo-Japanese War, with the British egging on Japan to go to war with Russia. You have a weak czar. Witte's trying to head this whole thing off. Russia was defeated. It was a humiliation, and it led to the 1905 revolution or revolt in Russia, and indirectly it led to the 1917 revolution later on. 12 years on. Initially there was the Triple Alliance put together by Bismarck, which is of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and France. And Italy against France, because they feared France. Germany feared France as a military threat. This goes back to an earlier war, the Franco-Prussian War. But I mean, I'm trying not to digress too far.
Okay.
But this
Triple Alliance with who again?
was Germany with Italy and Russia, put together by Bismarck, Chancellor of Germany at that time, still Chancellor, the key figure that's industrializing Germany, that's working with Russia for the industrialization policy and so forth. The Berlin to Baghdad Railway. So all of this is of this period, which the Berlin to Baghdad really is a piece of the List plan, right, for the railroad to Bombay. On the other hand, then there's the against Bismarck is the Triple Entente, which is the alliance. France is pulled out of the alliance, or pulled into an alliance with Britain and Russia. France, the old archenemy of Britain, is first pulled into an entente cordiale with Britain, and then into the three-way agreement with Russia. Russia being brought in against Germany, right, into this Triple Entente.
So Russia was in both of them?
Initially in the Triple Alliance, and then was brought over into the Triple Entente in 1907. In this period had occurred the Russo-Japanese War that I just spoke of, and this then, including the conflict over the Balkans, leads us into World War I. And let me just quote, I'm not trying to be comprehensive in terms of trying to run down the whole period, but it's been recommended several times. Barbara Tuchman's book, The Proud Tower, is the period leading up to World War I, and the Guns of August is the initial period of World War I in terms of the German offensive into France in particular. But here is as this whole environment is building of these cross-party secret agreements. Think of today, Xi Jinping, the Chinese in particular, make this point of not wanting secret agreements, secret coalitions. There has to be open agreements, like the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, open to all countries, including the United States. This all, in other words, you have to get beyond this deadly paradigm, right, of geopolitical manipulation, of playing one against the other and so forth, right? This bestial game in which nations are dragged down, right, as opposed to as opposed to following their better nature. So here is this is Kaiser Wilhelm, right? Bismarck's been dumped. Wilhelm was no great shakes, no great intellect, proud, arrogant, and therefore obviously stupid in that sense. You know, although not uneducated, certainly not. You know, he's a cosmopolitan, but but that doesn't get you anywhere really by itself. He never. This is Barbara Tuchman. He never actually wanted a general war. He wanted great power, greater prestige, above all, authority in the world affairs for Germany. Just in terms of a take. And Tuchman's anti-German, by the way. But, you know, you can read that out of the book as you go along. But that's her prejudice. But anyway, when Russia mobilized, this is after the shooting of the Archduke Ferdinand. This is 1914.
Yep.
Right in Sarajevo, in the Balkans. And Austro-Hungary, you know, this triggers these treaty agreements, right? Hungary comes in the port of Serbia, you know, and Germany behind that, and then on the other side. What?
So, I'm sorry, it was Austria, Germany, Serbia, Russia?
Well, Russia's gone over to the other side.
Oh, okay, not Russia.
Yeah. So Austro-Hungary is demanding, you know, their pound of flesh for the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand, right? Russia, I'm sorry, comes in on the side of Serbia, right? Okay. So then that brings in France and Germany implicitly on one side, and it brings in Germany on the other, right? But this has all been orchestrated, as I said, by Edward VII. Here's just, remember, they're relatives. I mean, they're you know, they're cousins of each other. Yeah, Archduke, you know, Kaiser Wilhelm is the cousin of Edward VII. So when Russia mobilizes, he bursts into a tirade, he being Kaiser Wilhelm, of passionate foreboding, not against the Slav traitors, but against the unforgettable figure of the wicked uncle. I'm sorry, he was the uncle. Edward VII is the uncle. Quote, the world will be, this is quoting Kaiser Wilhelm, the world will be engulfed in the most terrible of wars, the ultimate aim of which is the ruin of Germany. England, France, and Russia have conspired for our annihilation. That is the naked truth of the situation, which was slowly but surely created by Edward VII. The encirclement of Germany is at last an accomplished fact. We have run our heads into the noose. The dead Edward is stronger than the living I. That's, you know, that's it in a nutshell. That's World War I, right? With the horrendous consequences. So I think it's implicit. The Cold War, you know, World War II. I mean, there's numbers of books. Elliot Roosevelt says, as he saw it on his father, Franklin Roosevelt, and the negotiations with Stalin that is dealing with Churchill and the rest, and how he saw the world coming out of World War II, you know, is a very important book to read in this context. But in a nutshell, this is the continuation of this warfare, the Cold War. And the other dimension of the Cold War, just to mention it because it's important, is the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Because this is really where, you know, among other things, violent video games come from. The whole, you know, modernist and postmodern and whatever you want to call it, culture comes out of the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which was financed by the CIA in collaboration with the FBI, etc., as promoted everything that you think of: abstract expressionism, surrealism, pop art, journals, magazines, expositions, virtually every,
Was jazz part of that?
Pollock, Hannah Arendt. I mean, all basically were wined and dined, at the trough of the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And there's a book readily available on that. If people are interested, I can get that to you. I don't have it here in front of me, but that's.
What year was that?
This is the Cold War essentially starts in 1946. That's the Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, by Churchill, who had just lost re-election and came to the United States and delivered the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is descending, between the East and West. This is the continuation of this, and when you hear Vladimir Putin being accused of hacking the Democratic National Committee records and so on, and similar things, this is more just for grist from the mill. So let's open it up for discussion. There's more that could be said. There's all kinds of interesting veins that can be kind of brought, unearthed and brought forward in this. But I hope I've given you a clearer sense of this geopolitical thinking and as an infection, as a disease, as an infection. And it's a question, well, not a question, what's being picked up now. Really, with the New Silk Road, with the Eurasian land bridge, with this whole set of initiatives that we've been so much in the forefront of promulgating and promoting otherwise here, specifically in the United States. And of course, Helga-Zepp, LaRouche, and Bill Jones are right now in China, as we're talking. This is if you have that final, do you have that final image?
Yeah.
This is the overcoming, as Helga indicated. The U.S. and Europe must have the courage to reject geopolitics and collaborate with the BRICS. This is the new paradigm coming to being. This is the realization of what the American system, patriots of the United States, from Hamilton, Lincoln forward, were fighting for, and their allies throughout Eurasia. So I hope I've given you a good sense, and there's a lot more to be explored.
So the way you presented it is that the creation of British geopolitics was the British response to the universal outpouring and reproduction of American political economy and American system ideas around the world.
Right, and specifically in because of the implications of railroad technology, which is coal technology, and steam power and
British maritime power.
Right. As Mackinder is very explicit on, they don't. Yeah, they're no longer landlocked. Right. Russia's no longer landlocked, and Germany, of course, has access to Russia and vice versa and so forth, and the potential of a German-Russian alliance. I mean, that's the final thing. Let me just quote Margaret Thatcher. I mean, when the wall came down, in 1989, right? The British went absolutely ballistic on this. Nicholas Ridley, who was the Minister of Trade and Exports, said of this, of European integration, not what we have today, but what was being discussed then, and German reunification. He said, you might as well give, this is in the London Spectator, right? This is an interview at the time. This is in 1990. The wall came down in 1989. So the whole question of what's going to happen in terms of reunification, what's the policy towards Eastern Europe and so forth. He said, you might as well give it to Adolf Hitler. That would be the outcome of German reunification and what was referred to then as European integration, which was, basically collaboration among nations with sovereign currencies and so forth. This was the context, right, in December of 1989, where Alfred Herrhausen, chief economic advisor to Chancellor Kohl, was assassinated, right, was blown up in his armored car going to his office.
He had his own armored car?
Yeah, he was under protection of the, convoy. He was convoyed. This is the context of the terrorism that era.
The so-called Red Brigades did it, right?
The so-called third generation of
Red Army fraction.
Red Army fraction, or otherwise known as the Baader-Meinhof, so-called third generation did it, but that was never proven to even exist. What was known was the Baader-Meinhof members from the earlier quote-unquote generations had left in the earlier 1980s and gone to Eastern Europe to basically live out their lives. They basically had pulled up stakes and gotten themselves out of the way. And so there was never any proof of this third generation. And curiously, Schäuble, today's finance minister in Germany, this backward reactionary finance minister, was the interior minister of Germany at the time of the Herrhausen assassination, and was accused broadly, publicly, of stonewalling public information on the investigation into the Herrhausen assassination.
Well, Lenin sort of, I think he said it explicitly that he thinks the French were involved in French intelligence.
French networks, French. Yeah. This is. Let me just come back to Margaret Thatcher, but yes, along with Thatcher, Mitterrand and George Bush Sr. were adamant to attempt to stop reunification of Germany. Not because, but anyway, you can imagine what they use as excuses. You'll get a sense of this from Margaret Thatcher, but this is her autobiography, so but this is somewhat toned down from what she said. But it's known otherwise in terms of her statements, in terms of her diaries, her personal diaries, but also in terms of the record kept by other principals that were involved in terms of the British government. She was once a German, always a German. You can't trust them.
Racist against her.
Yeah, absolutely racist ideology. So let me just quote her, and then we'll come back. She's writing about this period. This is from her autobiography. There was and still is a tendency to regard, quote, the German problem as something too delicate for well-brought-up politicians to discuss. For a reunited Germany, she goes on, for a reunited Germany is simply too big and powerful to be just another player within Europe. Moreover, Germany has always looked east as well as west. Through it, though it is economic expansion rather than territorial aggression, which is the modern manifestation of this tendency. Germany is thus by its very nature a destabilizing rather than a stabilizing force in Europe. Only the military and political engagement of the United States in Europe and close relations between the other two strongest sovereign states in Europe, Britain and France, are sufficient to balance German power. That's, again, a simple geopolitical statement. We could quote Brzezinski and from the Grand Chessboard, but I think it's redundant at this point. You were asking in terms of Herrhausen. Yeah, so Mitterrand of France, who's and along with Bush, were absolutely intent. Mitterrand at one point told Kohl, if you reunify, it means war. It was that direct. George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, is quoted stating, "You'll never see me dancing on the Berlin Wall," which was not a comment about his lack of coordination or something. That's a statement.
What's kind of interesting here is that if you look at this, the idea of the railroads, right, that Count Witte and others were building. I mean, that's sort of the equivalent of the space age today.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't just mean there's a greater economic activity, but it means that there's a kind of unity of all mankind across the planet around a common objective, which is development. That's what Witte had in mind. That's what List had in mind. All nations would develop. And today, even through the Cold War, the idea has been there because of the U.S.-Russia collaboration that, started, I guess, I don't know when it started. I think Eisenhower almost would have had a sense of it. But anyway, the idea...
U.S.-Russia collaboration?
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. He was making an effort.
Yeah.
The U-2 incident basically shot him down in terms of that effort.
But the idea is that it's the dynamic is the same, because the question is still the issue is still, is it empire or is it civilization? And with the space program, there we have the basis for the kind of collaboration, universal purpose. And so it's interesting. Of course, then they're playing the same geopolitical game.
Yeah, I was looking at there was a little book put out, the 30th anniversary of NATO, and so there was a symposium, and so Reagan is there as President of the United States, Margaret Thatcher is there, and this is before Bush came in, and there's just a striking difference in terms of the tone of the speeches. I mean, it's not that they were so, profound, but Reagan, he's talking about, yes, we're protecting the free world, but as a result of our efforts, there's this increasing basis for peace. We're looking towards cooperation and collaboration, so on and so forth. And then you read Margaret Thatcher speak, the Soviet Union, this is the great menace. This is the same symposium. They're operating in completely different worlds. Yeah. I mean, that's why Reagan sent, had LaRouche negotiating with the Russians on the strategic defense initiative. Right? It was exactly from that, or Clinton's utilization of LaRouche, with Russia. Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
Not Hillary.
So Bill Clinton has, that's interesting. I mean, can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, no, I mean, a lot of it, I don't know a lot of the details, but the LaRouche was sent to jail under George H.W. Bush. The minute he got out of jail, let's see, what was it, 1995, 94? Was it still 94?
5 years.
Yeah, I knew it was 5 years.
President.
He heads to Russia. He's already been made a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences while he was sitting in prison, up in Minnesota. And so he gets out of prison and basically, essentially, immediately heads for Russia. And he's, in the course of the next few years, he and Helga are there. He's addressing the Duma, the Russian parliament. He's involved in the Russian Academy of Sciences. This whole question of an economic development program, of collaboration, the European Triangle, and also then the idea of a Russian, China, India triangle of collaboration, and that whole initiative is occurring in the Bill Clinton years, and this is being done, through intermediaries with Bill Clinton. And
Clinton never get.
Remember, Clinton himself was in Russia as a student. I mean,
he got impeached.
I guess, where am I? Well, what now? So wait, Bill Clinton, what I'm saying, I said, did Bill Clinton get flack over that? And you said he got impeached over that?
Yeah, he got impeached because he made a speech at the Council of Foreign Relations calling, after the Russian bond crisis in '98, calling for a protectionist policy from the third world so that they could develop without fear of currency speculation by George Soros.
Yeah, he called it a new financial architecture.
So Bill Clinton was a good guy in a respect.
And at that time, the Lewinsky thing was already going on, but it wasn't until this speech that it became a full-blown, get Clinton and shut down the presidency.
So they got the Lewinsky in there to give more power to the impeachment idea.
It was already a
If they didn't
scandal.
need to pull the lever, they wouldn't have pulled.
They escalated what was an ongoing thing around Lewinsky.
Well, and
because of
also
what
just
Clinton
to kind of
did.
bring it back to the main thread, Primakov had stepped in and become president of Russia. Primakov was a Arabist specialist. Prime Minister as opposed to president. Excuse me. Primakov became prime minister, and Primakov was on his way to the United States for negotiations with Clinton. When Al Gore called him on the plane, called Primakov on the plane, and said, "You probably want to turn your plane around. We just bombed Iraq." Serbia, excuse me, Serbia. Bombed Serbia. Going right back to what we're talking about. And Primakov did. He turned the plane around in midair. So
Al Gore
there.
called.
So phones
Primakov.
worked. So some kind of phones worked back then. I wonder what the altitude of the phone was. Was it 30,000 feet or lower?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, I'll look into it later.
Thanks, Joel. That was not Iraq. That was another mistake of Clinton's, was capitulating and bombing Iraq. But anyway, Serbia, that was much more damage to U.S.-Russian affairs.
I got a question.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so how does the British ability to manipulate on geopolitics, is it undermined by the Brexit, or how does that Brexit play into it?
Well, I mean, it's really incalculable. As Jeff was saying Thursday night, you have a new prime minister in Britain, May, and she's, she positioned herself as somebody who is neither for or against the Brexit. She just stayed out of that to basically position herself as the person in the Conservative Party that could pick up if Cameron lost the Brexit vote, because Brexit was, he was opposing the Brexit, right?
Yeah.
And that's what she's done. But that she's not, she's
What's
not
her name?
May, M-A-Y.
Okay.
But she is not a major figure. She's like a placeholder or something. She's not the Iron Lady, or she's not Margaret Thatcher. Not that Margaret Thatcher was ultimately responsible for what she did or didn't do.
I think that one way to think about it is that the whole Atlantic system is breaking down, and Brexit is the expression of that breakdown. I mean,
Well, that's what I was leading into.
Yeah.
That's what I was leading into. Yeah, that what you now have is circumstances that are created with the refugee crisis in Europe, but more generally the financial breakdown and economic breakdown that's ongoing that we were talking about earlier on, such that at this point their handle on the British Empire's handle on Europe, or much less any other part of the world, is massively reduced. As Helga put it, this may be a blessing in disguise. Not, that the vote against the Brexit was not based on necessarily the greatest of motives on the part of the voters themselves, but in terms of the consequences, it's going to be, it's part of this disintegration of the existing transatlantic system.
It seems like
power in the transit system.
when I was looking at documentaries about the for and against Brexit thingy, one of the things that they were saying was the people that Britain didn't have control over a lot of things, that it was done in Brussels, the people weren't elected. So what power you're saying Britain lost some power by leaving? Is it because they held a seat over in Brussels in this, EU forum, or what, how,
Well,
I'm
I'm not a specialist or an
on that
expert,
particular- okay.
but one of the most important features of it is the City of London. I mean, that is the source of Britain's wealth, of its export earnings, if you will, of its balance of payments, is the City of London's financial take as the center of international finance. And the conditions under which Britain maintained its kind of half in, half out position within the European Union, right? Britain has its own currency, so on and so forth, right?
To the European Union, right.
Now with the Brexit is severely undermined. And so, there's the kind of den of thieves kind of situation where the financial sharks, in Paris, you can imagine in Paris and Frankfurt and wherever, are saying, come hither, London's out of the picture, they're out of the agreements that exist.
We'll give you a much better deal.
Yes, we'll give you the agreements that Britain had to have special rights, essentially access to financial markets, banks, to be able to sell certain financial products and so on and so forth. In Europe, those agreements were part of the agreements with the EU. Those agreements are now severed, or will be severed, as Article 50 is actually, called up or whatever, initiated, and the process actually officially begins. Those ties are cut.
What brings to mind is some of the ricocheting effects of the Brexit vote as it relates to the financial crisis in Europe, especially because, it rocked these institutions, and now they're coming out with these stress tests, and they're failing these stress tests. So it's forced two things to the fore that I think were lingering or lurking beneath the media radar, which was the intrinsic bankruptcy of the Inter Alpha group of banks, and the
Inter Alpha, the so-called Rothschild group.
Yeah, the so-called 24
banks,
failed banks.
so on and so forth.
Yeah, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, all those. And now it's becoming more obvious. Like, these guys are bankrupt, and they're doing these stress tests, so it forces the issue of the Glass-Steagall solution much more. The stress test was, can they survive another 2008 type crisis?
And the reason I'm just thinking it, because we did the protest or whatever the other day.
In front of Deutsche Bank?
Yeah, so I went in while they were doing their thing. I didn't feel well educated enough, so I went into my bank, Bank of America, which they thought Deutsche Bank was there, but it's not anymore. They're closing shop over there in that beautiful building. But so I went, and they thought they misunderstood me. I was going to ask some questions. They thought I wanted to invest in mutual funds. So they got two guys with ties on, young men who were sitting me down, and yeah, we'll get someone for you. So I sat down and I kept asking questions about, well, is the bank, what stock and whatever used to be 80, now it's down to, 12. Why did the Bank of America stock go down? Is it because of the shares, whatever, when they cut the shares in half, Anyway,
diluted the shares. Yeah.
Diluting the share, so it's not really that they lost value, it's just that they can, But these guys didn't know what I was talking about, or and the guy kept jumping in saying, "So, were you interested in a mutual fund?" It's obviously trying to get me inside, and I kept jumping and saying, "Well, and have you heard of, and I was trying to get into like the World Bank and John Perkins, and they started getting irritated with me finally, and said, You know, you seem to know a lot more than the average investor about mutual funds.
You're not a sucker.
And he was like acting like, are you trying to lead us into something? And I mean, he said it in kind of a sarcastic or something like, are you some kind of reporter with a machine, you're recording this? I don't know, but I didn't mean to get him upset. I mean,
asking him about the truth is going to get him upset axiomatically.
I guess, because the way he said it was like, and then he said, well, I've got another thing I've got to go, but this man can enter. But the reason, so I went into the thing about it. So I said, well, you know, the mortgage back, I don't think I used the term because I couldn't think of it now. So I was kind of nervous. But I was thinking, you know, if y'all were suckers for the mortgage back, whatever, securities that brought the thing down, you know, whatever, and then y'all say, oh, well, we didn't take the money, we were forced, that was forced to us. Well, I'm thinking if it was the American government forced you to take it, then why did your stock drop? You're just like, oh, yeah. You know, and they didn't answer that question. They seemed confused. They were too young. Like, well, we don't know about that stuff. And then I talked about Deutsche Bank. Oh, well, we have much higher standards. I'm just telling you so y'all can answer back to this or do some research on it. They said, well, our standards are much higher. We have different, we didn't say higher. He said, our standards are much different than the Deutsche Bank and how they run things there. We have different things. We did a stress test of the bank recently, and it was, we get 24/7, we are regulated up to the max, and we did a stress test, and you will be happy to know, you know, it was very strong. It showed strong numbers and all that. So I would like to, I mean, even if you know anything about the stress test they're talking about.
Well, the stress test that we're talking about is, they just did a stress test. Oh, we were talking about this earlier before you came in, but they just announced the outcome of the stress test at 10 o'clock at night, Brussels time, you know, on Friday night. So the markets are closed.
Right.
And the Monte Paschi, the big Italian bank, failed. Deutsche Bank barely passed. Anyway, it was all a bunch of rigmarole. Nobody believes it. But everybody was hanging to see what was going to happen.
What the stress
and a bailout was announced at 9 o'clock, an hour before the release of the report, that a package deal had been figured out for the Monte Paschi, you know, in which, anyway, the Italian government's going to effectively do a bailout.
Yeah. On the bailout, though, I mean, since there isn't a Glass-Steagall for Europe or Italy, this would be another move towards an inflationary runaway situation.
Yeah, it's no solution whatsoever. No,
So
LaRouche's response was to say, forget it. You know, forget this
it's
bailout.
just putting off the inevitable.
Italian government, yeah, should drop the guarantees. Forget it. You know, this game is over. It's over. The banks are dead. You know, you've got to move with actual solutions. You've got to move with actual action. Glass-Steagall action. The stress test here was a stress test of all the American banks. Does anyone remember there were two banks? It was the too big to fail banks. At least two of the banks failed the test at the time. I can't remember. Another one was like in
Citibank. Was Citibank pretty unhelpful?
I think that was one of them. And
What
then there
about
was
JP Morgan?
No, it wasn't JP Morgan. They passed.
Bank of America.
I think it was.
No, I think it was like Garrett.
But they're not.
Anyway, the point is overall is that stress tests are a joke. First of all, they're not systemic. It's just testing one bank at a time. But the banks, in terms of the derivatives positions, derivatives are traded almost entirely among the banks. So with the blowout, the derivatives are going to go. So, and then there's a question of who pays whom.
So that's another thing.
So you can't test the banks one at a time. You've got to deal with the system, which is even what, you know, senior people, you know, at the FDIC and so forth say, is that, you know, like Bill Honig, the vice chairman of FDIC, is that, you know, it's the systemic nature that you've got to look at. That's what you got to look at. You can play all kinds of funny money games with the numbers otherwise.
And that's what I guess they're not being honest with the American people about, because all the people on the lower levels, in which, you know, like the guys I talk to, you know, they keep quoting, oh, well, your money's whatever for $250,000 FDIC, you know, I mean, but
that's only if you have a CD.
Oh, it's only if you have a CD?
No, that's bank
I think it's
deposits.
anything, it's
But
anything.
the
But
issue
if
is, but then the
everything falls
issue
at
is,
the same
what if
time-
the FDIC doesn't have the money?
Right.
If you have a
that's my
systemic
point.
crisis, the
The
FDIC
systemic
does
crisis,
not have the money.
250,000 go bye-bye, I mean, you're not gonna see
No.
the 250, it's
No.
gonna be a major, so that's what they're not honest about, is that's only if it's one bank failing, but if Wells Fargo and Bank of America and Citibank and JP
Yes.
Morgan, all of them are all connected somehow in the fall, where's.
So
how are you
so
gonna-
Helga was reporting, look, we have it on very good word from very senior people in the banking community. These are people we're in dialogue with around the LaRouche's Herrhausen proposal, for how to save Deutsche Bank, but not by, as Ian was pointing out, not by the kind of bailout that Italy's government just agreed to, but a recapitalization, but based on a reconfiguration of the bank back to Herrhausen principles as an industrial bank, writing off all the crap, the derivatives positions, underlining that, writing it off. Right? She was saying that, so in the process of the discussion of this proposal with banking officials, they told us, they leveled with us, that right now the central banks are engaged in is printing press operations. Not the printing press we're all familiar with. They're printing currency. They're printing loads of currency because they know the system is going to freeze up. The system is going to go. And so they want buku, tonnage of currency on hand because they're going to have to try to create a liquid market in conditions in which the banks aren't operating, in which there is not liquidity.
Huh.
And in which in the context in which your ATM stops functioning.
Yeah, and you can't pay for groceries at the store with your ATM card.
Right, and so on and so on and
So
so
you
forth.
need how would that affect the cash money? So if I
Well,
have,
it's completely inflation.
yeah, so I would have my mattress
Hybrid.
with some, but I'd need a lot of that money to buy the milk.
Yeah, more and more.
That's
Right.
why in Weimar, Germany, they
Because-
have a picture of a housewife lighting her stove with banknotes, because that's what they were worth.
Because the fundamental issue is
Yeah.
that credit is the basis that moves the physical economy. It's not just what you or I use, to buy groceries. Is what does it take to get the groceries there? What does it take for the farmer to go get the food to the warehouses, to get it to where it's finished, the trucks to deliver it? All of that works on credit. If you have a shutting down of the banking system, a shutting down of credit,
Shut down everything, physical.
then nothing moves. So you're talking about genocide. So the second point, though, more importantly, to go back to the four laws, is it goes back, as you know, I have some sense of, it goes back to the issue of productivity in terms of the real economy. That all of these games in terms of money, stress tests and currency and so on, so none of this monetarist theory addresses what Friedrich List or LaRouche or Hamilton, were basing themselves upon, and which we have to return to, which is to address the conditions that will make human beings, men and women, creative, right, and efficiently to produce wealth. That's what has to be addressed, because we've got to meet the requirements not only of today but the future. And so, beyond the immediate requirements, then of course there's the question of the of new breakthroughs, new discoveries, the question of science, new technologies, and all the rest. But that is not being addressed by any of this outside of Lynn's specific proposal now, very timed to the circumstances of this return to Herrhausen principles, which was the last time that Germany, had its head screwed on straight. And there's many people in Germany as well as where they know it. So Germany, once again, as our discussion person here that we were talking about, Mackinder, understood in a negative way, Germany has a very potent role to play right now, in bringing together this new paradigm under these conditions, which are really profound, really existential.
But you're saying it's going in a bad way, that because Italy is taking a course I don't know how that's tied to the, I'm confused about how's that to do with the Deutsche Bank? Is Italy tied with Germany being?
Well,
or something?
part of it, I mean, there's been articles on it just in the financial press, Zero Hedge and Bloomberg and so forth. There, you know, you can imagine because of derivatives, you know, there's default swaps held on the
I
debt.
don't know what that default swaps.
Oh, that means I'm holding Italian bonds, but those bonds might go bad, bank bonds,
Right?
right? So I go to a third party and say,
Would you like to take a risk on this?
yeah, I want to insure, I want to protect my investment in these bonds. How much do I have to pay you to protect my money? And you know, if that guy is like AIG, they'll say, oh, I'll do it for pennies. You know, and then AIG went bankrupt in 2008, right? The insurance company, right? Right.
Sure.
So
How's
the
the-
mortgage.
That's
You
the fake interest rates.
know,
We were
right,
having
right.
targets.
Yeah, there's all kinds of permutations,
before.
but that's but anyway, what I'm saying is the other banks, including Deutsche Bank, but also American banks and French banks, have major exposure in Italian banks. So if the Italian banks go, it's not going to just be felt in Italy.
Yeah.
It's again systemic, like you were using the term before, systemic.
Oh, you may not
Yeah.
have heard that Monty DiPaci was followed up by Monty Python.
What? Is this a joke?
This is
No, it's not.
this morning. If that wasn't heard by everybody,
Something about
the
money.
breaking news is that Monty DiPaci was just swallowed up by Monty Python.
Oh, okay.
That was the joke from Joel in the back of the
Thank you,
room.
Joel.
On a lighter note, yes. So let's wrap it. We can continue the discussion, but thank you for joining us today.
Wow. Oh, does anybody want to hear a little